Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm Amy McGuire, your host for tonight's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please consider supporting these authors by purchasing their books from our wonderful bookseller partner, Politics and Prose. You'll find purchase links in the presentation description. Given all that we've been through over the past year, it's so important to support local and independent stores. I also want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 featured sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Okay, let's begin. With us today are celebrated poets Miles David Moore, Naomi Thiers, and Jane Schapiro, who will explore how poetry can aid the process of grief, as well as the themes of memory and aging, as they share poems from their collections. Man on Terrace with Wine by Miles David Moore is a dark but always hopeful carnival that juggles both sonnet and emoticon with the ease of a poet who has been at it for a long time. Miles David Moore is the author of 3 full-length collections of poetry. He is a retired journalist who contributes a monthly film column to the online arts magazine, Scene 4. For 23 years, Miles organized and hosted the Iota Poetry Reading Series in Arlington, Virginia, and spent 7 years as a member of the board of directors of The Word Works. The poems in Maid of Air by Naomi Thiers celebrate the lives of women and girls and commemorates the daily ways they navigate through potential disaster and come through dancing. Naomi Thiers is the author of 3 poetry collections, Only the Raw Hands Are Heaven, which won the Washington Writers Publishing House Award, in Yolo County, and She Was a Cathedral. Her poems and fiction and essays have been published in Virginia Quarterly Review, Poet Lore, Colorado Review, Grist, Sojourners, and other magazines and anthologies. She is the former poetry editor of Phoebe and works as an editor for Educational Leadership magazine. Warbler by Jane Schapiro is an achingly beautiful paean to family, friendship, love, and memory. It is also a searing reminder that loss, illness, and grief must play their parts as well. Jane Schapiro is the author of 3 volumes of poetry and the nonfiction book Inside a Class Action, The Holocaust and the Swiss Banks, which was selected for the Notable Trials Library. Her chapbook, Mrs. Cave's House, won the 2012 Sal's Ear Poetry Chapbook Competition. Her work has appeared in American Scholar, Ars Medica, Beltway Poetry Quarterly, the Gettysburg Review, Gargoyle, Prairie Schooner, the Southern Review, and Women's Review of Books. Moderating today's poetry panel is Kirsten Porter. Kirsten is a freelance editor, poet, professor, and guest lecturer. She has taught creative writing, composition, and literature studies at Marymount University, and is the editor of the Collected Poems of E. Ethelbert Miller. Kirsten's poems have been featured in Poet Lore, the Limberlost Review, and This Is What America Looks Like. Welcome, Miles, Naomi, Jane, and Kirsten.
Thank you, Amy, for that very nice introduction. My name is Kirsten Porter, and today I will be serving as the panel moderator. So let's jump in. In today's panel, Miles David Moore, Jane Schapiro, and Naomi Thiers will discuss how poetry can help us process our grief, as well as explore issues of memory and aging. While the panel will look closely at despair, the poets will also speak on the light and hope that poems can find in the darkness. Today, we will start with our first reader, Miles David Moore. He's going to be reading from his book, Man on Terrace with Wine. Miles, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Kirsten, and thanks to the organizers of the festival for inviting us all. I'm going to read 4 poems altogether, 3 of which deal generally with the subjects of grief and memory, and also, not incidentally, family. The 4th, I hope, will bring a little levity to the festivities, but I'm going to begin with a poem about my mother when she was in assisted living. This is called an angel in winter. She is folding in upon herself a frost-tinged flower, her legs as frail as dandelion stems. Sleeping 16 hours out of 24, she is a translucent spirit, all time the same to her. Sometimes she wakes with newborn eyes on an alien world. What's wrong, Mom? Did you have a dream? Though her voice comes slowly, softly. Honey, I feel I've been touched by the hand of God. Continuing with the idea of memory and also with dreams, this is about a dream I had when I was 5 years old. This is called Grandma and the Hurricane. The Big Dipper, she's losing. The wind is so strong that it blows the constellations around in the sky. Never losing their shape, they are cookie cutters tumbling against each other. A spray of misty stars spills from the Big and Little Dippers and from the jug of Aquarius. The two fish of Pisces flop helplessly, impaled on the trident of Poseidon. Aries, Taurus, and Leo charge Sagittarius, who cannot steady his bow. Canis Minor laughs to see such sport. Earth, caught in the gale, feels unsteady under your feet. There is only one thing to do. Tell Grandma. You watch the cartoon you running into Grandma's house. The real you stands in her kitchen, warm and smelling of the chicken broth that simmers with her homemade noodles on the old-fashioned stove. She is snapping beans into her battered iron pot, as you have seen her do more times than you can count in your half-decade of life. Grandma is calm and patient. She always is. What is it, honey? She asks, not looking up from her beans. You want to say, Grandma, Grandma, there's a hurricane. You know that if you say that, everything will be all right. But the invisible hand reaches from behind and grips your mouth. All you can say is, Grandma never looks up. She never learns of the danger that only you could warn her of. And you wake up in your calm, dark bedroom, a gentle breeze playing in the starlight outside your window. You think of that again, waking not a half decade, but a half century later in a howling wind of February. Invisible hands throw fistfuls of stars at your windows. The 3 a.m. clouds admit no light. The street lamps flicker in the storm. You're alone, and you can see Grandma only in your dreams. This is another poem about childhood and also about memory, and particularly remembering those kindnesses you can never repay. This is called A Lesson from a Tooth. You learn the wages of gluttony for candy and cookies when you are 6, but also the meaning of love. The one who stays beside you into the night, placing slivers of ice on a baby tooth, those shards the only thing between you and screaming agony. The tooth will be pulled in the morning, but this is still night. The shadows on the wall are blobs of pain contorting with the spasms in your jaw, and all that spares you are the icy spoon, the gentle hand and face. In the rushed journey between 6 and 60, you hope you have learned more lessons than a rotted tooth can teach you. But above all, you hope, through all the shadows, you have done something 1,000th as good as sitting at a bedside through the night, offering your heart spoon by spoon. And my last poem is a bit of a change of pace. This is about how we all have our embarrassments in life, and how we cope with them with a little wry humor and a shrug. And this is, I would call this a 21st century example of that. This poem is called Emoticon. Colon, right parenthesis, smiley face, appended sideways to an email's end. You carry on your non-existent back the weight of every email, of every writer's good intentions. You are the irony accessory, the tacked on laugh, the shrug, the raised eyebrow to show the humor in what reads on screen as a punch in the face. The modulating warmth of a human voice or a human hand scrawl upon paper, read in warm lamplight, is lost in the computer's literal glare. You are the fall guy, the kick me sign stuck on a sentence's butt. So when someone does want to kick you, and believe me, someone will, your changeless smile shows your good grace in accepting what serves you right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miles. Our next reader, Jane Schapiro. Jane will be reading from her most recent collection, Warbler.
Thank you, Kirsten. This is a great opportunity to be on the panel with you and Naomi and Miles. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm going to read 4 poems from Warbler, the first section of which deals with a very personal grief I experienced several years ago. A young woman from Israel came to live in my community, and she and I grew very close. And at 28, she got breast cancer and passed away at 31. And I realized during that grieving period, for grieving for somebody that is across an ocean, didn't fit into any real clear label. I mean, she wasn't a peer and she wasn't a blood relative. So the prescribed rituals didn't really apply, the ones that I was familiar with. And so how that affected the mourning process and made it more isolating than usual. And I think of that now during this past year of COVID, where so many people have lost people that may be outside of their immediate circles, but their losses nonetheless. And just even all Americans who have lost, 500,000 fellow citizens. And how does one mourn individually and grieve individually for that kind of loss? So this first poem is called Gravity, which is at the root of the word grief. Gravity. Mourning is reserved for parents, saying Kaddish, siblings sitting Shiva, peers sharing stories, mentors naming scholarships, employers founding awards, neighbors bringing meals, communities hanging plaques. But for me, who is none of these, too old to be labeled friend, too needy to be a sage, titleless, yet connected, for I also crossed paths with her life, was drawn into its eddy, that mighty whirl, feel it even now while sitting in a room across the sea. For me, there is no gesture, no blessing, no right to perform, just a pool tugging deep inside like an anchor that won't dislodge. Though I try, grab the word, grief, sharp sorrow, follow it down, see grieve, graver, to burden, down, derivative of grab is heavy, and down, grave, gravity, to its source, the force by which a planet or other body draws objects towards its center. The next poem is called Lost Blog. And another realization I had during this experience was just how interwoven technology is with memory and how we leave prints in the cloud, whether we intended to or not. So this is called Lost Blog. Somewhere in the cloud with your tooth-filled grin, your alias is lamenting men. On the internet, keeping tabs, she's recounting her love life, the good dates, the bad, cradling a laptop and beer on a Tel Aviv beach. Your pseudonym is typing as high tide draws near. She hasn't a clue you no longer exist. There will be no more names to add to her list. And anonymity is key, you claimed. You never revealed her website or name. I would love to find her, set her straight. No knight can win against cold-hearted fate, but part of me still clings to hope, would rather leave an encouraging post. Keep writing, dreaming. The next one is called We Will Win. And it's really more or less an ode to hope, which I believe is maybe the most vital, strong, resilient component of the human spirit. And it's uniquely human and can console even long past the loss. So we will win. Nothing, not the doctor's terminology, your father's flood of tears, your brother's ashen face, your sister's dread-filled eyes, not diagnosis, prognosis, fear, shock, nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing could beat back the blazes of hope. I remember your voice exploding, igniting each word, sending out sparks. We will win, spread through, around, inside of me. Though your promise burned to ash, I return to that oath, its power, its strength, its brilliant flame, and shudder in its radiance. And the last poem is called Starling, and it's based on a true anecdote of Mozart. He had a pet starling for several years. And a writer, Leanda Lynn Haupt, wrote a book called Mozart's Starling. So the epigraph on this is a quote from her book. And the only other thing I want to say is my young friend's name was Shiri, and Shir in Hebrew means song. Starling, quote, Mozart discovered the starling in a Vienna pet shop where the bird had somehow learned to sing the motif from his newest piano concerto. Enchanted, he bought the bird for a few kreuzer and kept it for 3 years before it died. Just how the starling learned Mozart's motif is a wonderful musical ornithological mystery. 1. In version 1, the starling, perched by an open window, hears Mozart ambling the streets, whistling. Drawn to the melody drifting in, the bird begins to trill. 2. In version 2, Mozart, ambling the streets, passes an open window, hears a starling trilling. Drawn to the melody drifting out, he begins to transcribe. 3. Trilled, whistled, sung, or heard, melody is a heroine, that pulsating wave traversing space, connecting bird and man, as animate as an organism, as invisible as air, as alive as memory. 4. If I've learned anything, it's that the window must be open. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Our final reader, Naomi Thiers. Naomi will be reading from her current book. I love all these books, and their covers are so beautiful. This is Made of Air by Naomi Thiers. Naomi.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm just so happy to be here reading today. It's a real joy. And a big thanks to everybody who has made this possible. So I'm going to start with a poem on the theme of hope. And it's kind of has to do with generating your own hope and your own light, even in sad, difficult circumstances. How can it be? The only way to have hope, how can it be, is to walk into the streets not as a beggar, not as one crushed to a shadow, holding a cup, begging for bread or a place to stand, but to walk like a man in a parade, pockets filled with candy to toss to children as you pass, as if lit from within, as if joy were a friend you can call on any time, even days you're too sad to dress or untangle your hair. Pull on a bright shirt and walk out as if heading to Joy's house for tea and a chat. Joy may still turn you from her door that day, but I know hope will catch up with you, hook her arm through yours and match your stride, even if neither of you can speak. So the second section of my book is poems about getting older, about aging. And one of the things about getting older, is you start to lose some of your friends. You know, it's just natural. Some of your friends start to die. So I'm going to read two poems along those lines. The first is honoring a friend of mine who died about a few years ago. The second one is more generally thinking about how people we've lost kind of come back to us in random moments. Little things of them come back to us. All or None, for Carolyn Poole. Integrity was never so buoyant, the hand of giving and of fairness, never so light, so angled in a joyful invitation to dance as with you, friend. It wasn't only in the swirled yellows, greens, and ochres of your paintings, the African heat of your missionary childhood, that you gave your all, drenched everyone in your vision. It was all or nothing with you in your cooking, your art classes, even your day job. The writers you edited felt they had been knighted. Just as you gave freely to your children, two birthed, two adopted. When your mother invited to visit each summer, just the two natural ones, you said, they're all my children. Invite them all or none. Carolyn, you loved like the equatorial sun, rays of joy, refusing to leave anyone in shadow. And this is called How They Come Back to Us. Those who have died, their roots still spread, their fires still spread, smoking underground. They emerge as tree roots will, bursting out of earth, far from the hollow where we once dropped in a memory. So long ago, it's only a flash, something that happened to a paper doll. What comes back full color are faces, pieces of faces. Grandma's powdered cheek, red fuzz at Chris's temple, Patty's eyes, the bare blue of skies after rain. And their never replaceable voices, their vocabulary. Sit with me once. How are you doing there, Papa Son? I wouldn't have that, Rosie. I just wouldn't have that. Sparks of their movements blaze. How they danced, say. Karen's arms twirling overhead. Chris's plant and stomp. Their pet ideas, their coined metaphors float in the margins as you read. As Jacqueline Potter's motto was suddenly there on a brick in Chincoteague, Toujours le mot, stamped with her signature. Like creeper vines shooting beneath lawns, bursting out to wind around trees, minding their own business, the dead still come to decorate strange places with their unmistakable shapes, their sudden air bracing, their unseen heat keeping us warm. Just going to read two more. So the first section of my book, Made of Air, is all portraits of women, mostly resilient women. So I'm going to read two of those. This one is kind of trying to imagine a teenage refugee girl from Syria. Refugee 15. Fear is in your bread, and you must choke it down. To think of home, the courtyard with its red filigreed rug, the peel paint walls, how the breeze with its tang of the Kaba River touched your just cut hair as you curled up writing in your diary, starts the rock slide of grief. The thundering that blocks out sound pulls a knife across each breath until you drag your body like a sack, walking with others toward the border. But something rises up, wants to live. I won't be that man sitting on his burned porch, face a lace of cuts, waiting in rain for death. Shut away now the images of hope, like the leather straps of your diary. Preserve your young life. Eat your bread. I'm going to close with one written for a friend of mine who struggles a lot with depression. This is called Your Light, and it's in a Persian form called a ghazal, so you'll hear some repetition. Your light. Somehow you spin a thread of hope, pale gold, out of your history, your sad blood summoning light. Send up a flare of laughter beneath a hard load. So many chores, sullen children. You drudge in light and cup that flame even as your mood spins down to black. Depression stalks in its studded collar. Light a cigarette, call a friend, take your Paxil, hold on in this season of cold mud until you sit in light April air and smell green in the world. Brush your long blonde hair. Its flood of yellow light, its beauty has been with you all your life. Consolation for the lack of light and hope in too many days. Cherish your light. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. And thank you again, Jane and Miles. These are beautiful readings, and I think this will really help kind of illuminate what we're going to talk about in the discussion. So now I'd like to shift to where we can kind of look more into your work. And I think looking at the themes of grief and memory and aging and light and hope, which I see in all of your pieces, kind of a common thread, would be a good place to start. So let's look at grief first. I have a few questions, and then we'll kind of have each one of you talk a little bit about it. So for grief, I was thinking that in your collections, while they're all different, they do all contain poems that speak of a profound grief and sadness. How do you think that your poetry can, and poetry arguably more than any other genre, can help us express our pain and loss, especially, Jane mentioned in the current pandemic state. What do you think the role of the poet or the poem should be in terms of individual and collective grieving and healing? And why don't we just start with Miles, since he read first, and then we'll kind of talk with each one of you.
Well, it's always been my feeling that poetry at its best expresses what is almost inexpressible. I mean, that it conjures up a depth of feeling that other forms of literature and other arts don't really do. I see poetry as the most precise of arts, that with using words, you can pinpoint exactly an emotion, like an individual emotion or an emotion of a time. And I think if you're speaking specifically of the pandemic, poets are sort of the, how can I put it, the chroniclers. I mean, the news stories tell us what's happening. The poets tell us what it feels like to be there as it happens. So, that is my feeling. Obviously, for more personal griefs, you can only express what you feel, and you hope that what you express will be universal.
So true. Yeah, I like what you said, Miles, about poets can be kind of give the voice to the real personal. The news can give us kind of the overhead numbers of like how many people are dying, but we can tell the individual stories. And I see that in all of your work. I can visualize the people that you're talking about, and what a beautiful tribute that each one of you, Miles' grandmother, Jane's friend, Naomi had a few friends, really quite beautifully expressed. Jane, how about you? And you had mentioned about how you look at poetry in the pandemic. What more can you say about grief?
Well, I agree with Miles in the sense that grief is quite inarticulate. It's such an inward, insular, isolating feeling. And so to be able to grab at words, both as a reader, as a writer, it's, I think it helps, if you can name it, it helps to guide one through, not past or over, but just through the grief. And so I look at poets and writers as that. And I also think, again, I echo Miles in that they're reminders of the universality of loss and grief. Wendell Berry has a great poem about how the natural world, they don't feel the despair and the grief. And actually that's where you go for solace. You can go for solace. And so I think poets can be reminders of where to find that solace in the greater world, in life outside our own heads. And so for both, for naming it and for reminding us, I think are very important roles that writers and poets can have in the world of grief.
Yes. And certainly, I'm hoping that your work helped you process a lot of that just overwhelming grief. I think as writers, it can be very cathartic.
That's right.
Naomi, how about you? You also have a lot of grief in your work. How do you see it as playing a role?
I feel that making any kind of art, and I don't actually think poetry more than any other kind. I think music, visual art, any kind of art you make can really help us do several things with grief and pain. It helps us confront it, focus on it, maybe focus on what you've lost, describe it, express the pain and the loss, and then kind of transform it. And I think that happens as you read a poem, certainly, but also as you write it. As you said, it's cathartic. So rather than glossing over it, you focus, you confront it, and then you express it. And somehow expressing, the grief and pain in any art form just kind of frees something up. I guess because you're not devoting the energy to suppressing it. So it frees things up. So I see that as the role of really all the arts.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, transformation, both for the reader and the writer, right? That's the goal. Okay, thank you for that on grief. Let's look then at memory and aging. A few thoughts, and then we'll go again to Miles and kind of open up the discussion. Has poetry helped you to reframe any memories that have haunted you or stuck with you over time? And does writing poetry help you confront issues of aging and the losses attached to getting older? How do you see that in your work?
I would say very, very definitely yes. Again, poetry, I said it's the most precise of the arts. I think it's also the most intimate of the arts. I mean, you really, as Yeats said, you must go down where all the well springs start to the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And yet, it's a way of confronting memory, sometimes painful ones, but also sometimes joyous ones. It's a way of recovering joy. I find that poetry helps you find a certain cadence, a certain discipline for your thoughts, for your memories, so that you can put them in a context you can grasp and you hope others can grasp. I find it very therapeutic.
Yeah, I loved your poem, the grandmother poem, because it, after the death of my grandmother, poetry, you're right, could help me remember like things that maybe weren't so great, but also joyful memories with her that, long after she's gone, I'll have on the page. So that's wonderful. Both joy and we want to remember that while this panel does look at grief, there's also a lot of hope and joy in your work. Jane, how about you? How do you see that playing a role, memory and aging?
Well, so this is a little bit of a different take, but on aging and writing. If unlike some of the other arts like dance and trades like athletic and vocations, writing is not dependent on the body. So we need to have the cognitive senses, fully aware. And if we're fortunate for that, I have found that aging and writing has become a much more liberating experience. To shed some of the youthful distractions of ambition, self-consciousness, restlessness, some of the roles that were center stage that aren't now, has allowed me anyway to write more freely and with less, in a purer form. So in a way, aging and writing for me has been a more positive experience than I would have imagined.
I'm laughing, Jane, because when you're talking about the body giving out, I had to think about back to when I met you. And we were working in a tutoring program for athletes. And Jane was my colleague years ago. And we always worried about when that when the athletes that were wonderful, talented athletes, when their bodies gave out, could we give them a skill that they could still have? And, you know, and yet as writers, you're right. You know, obviously cognitively, we need, you know, that to remain, but we do have the advantage of, you know, not having to retire because all of a sudden we don't have 20-year-old bodies anymore, right? Naomi, how about you with aging and memory? What do you think?
I think I'm going to talk about aging and how writing affects that. So I find one thing is you're getting older, you need to really start sort of keeping track of where you get your energy. It's one thing you think about a lot because you just don't have the ready store of energy, you know, that you had when you were younger. So you need to start really thinking about, okay, what things are going to give me energy? And I find for me, writing poetry is just a tremendous source of energy for me, psychic and spiritual, I mean, and physical as well. And I don't think we talk about that enough. You know, people talk about how writing drains you and it's so scary and blah, blah, blah. But it's a terrific energy generator to me. And I feel you hear people say that when they read a poem, you know, it shakes up their perspective, you get more possibilities, more idea of possibilities. But I feel that when I write a poem, my perspective gets shaken up. I feel like there's more possibilities. I almost feel like a kind of magic has occurred sometimes, you know, when I've finished a poem in the writing of it. So it's a tremendous source of energy. I think we need to keep that in mind. And I want to just quickly read a quote from this poet, Jimmy Santiago Baca. I just love this quote connected to energy. So he's started writing poetry when he was in prison, kind of almost like a young juvenile delinquent type. And he was stuck in prison and he started reading and writing poetry. And he says, when you work with a poem long enough, just do that one poem and don't worry about anything else. The imagery of one verse line will exude a sparkling fountain of energy that fills your spirit. And I just think that quote from Jimmy Baca is so true. And I just love it. So
I love that too. A good reminder, yeah, that poetry is magical and can re-energize us.
Yeah,
definitely. And reading poetry too.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when I am just low energy and just the day is not just going right, I curl up with a good book of my favorite poems and I just feel better. You know, I just feel re-energized. Wonderful. And so then looking at the last, which kind of shifts right into this kind of idea that poetry can give us something magical and re-energizing, some light and some hope when there's a lot of darkness. And this past year, even more now, we've had a lot of darkness to wade through. So is it important for you to show light and hope in your work, especially when writing on more painful topics? Does humor have a place in poetry? And also from a more pragmatic perspective, when you are getting to that point where you've written a collection and you're organizing the pieces, constructing an order for your poems, do you feel like you need to order your poems so that there are breaks of light amidst the more painful pieces? So I know I just threw a lot at you, but I'm really interested in what you guys think about light and hope and how that kind of comes across in your pieces. Miles, what do you think?
Well, I believe that any poet who doesn't have light and hope in his or her work is falling down on the job. You have to express joy. You have to, in the end, you have to show people that life is worth living. And I mean, like for me, humor's always been a way of doing that. I caught some flack early on in my career because all I wrote in my first few years was light verse, which is generally been frowned upon. I mean, like, one of my favorite poets of all time is Ogden Nash. And the general attitude towards Nash, I think, can be summed up, that today's idea can be summed up in the movie Kill Your Darlings, and particularly in the scene where the actors playing William S. Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg see Ogden Nash in a New York bar and start mocking him behind his back. Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that humor has no place in poetry has been very prevalent, and I'm sorry, I reject that. It's more than just a coping mechanism. It's a way, again, of telling truths. I mean, it might not be love, death, eternity, whatever, but embarrassment, awkwardness, feelings of inadequacy. Humor is a very good way of dealing with that. And to speak to what Naomi was saying, it can add energy. I mean, it can lift your spirits, and with that, your perceptions.
We definitely heard that humor in Emoticon. I couldn't help but laugh while you were reading it.
I had fun writing that.
Yeah, and you could tell there's a joy and a levity in that poem that was very much needed for me. So, Jane, how about you? Light, hope, humor?
So light and hope.
Yes.
Yes, there's a definite, it's a definite part and parcel of the whole process. Humor, I will say that I'll confess, I have always wanted to write a funny poem. I have always wanted to, and I have always failed. Because somehow when I start to write a funny poem, then I'm conscious that I'm writing a funny poem and then it's not funny. Now, C.K. Williams, who I worked with while he was here in Northern Virginia, told me, and it's always stuck with me, that a successful poem is like a successful joke, that it has to have the same a pacing and an arc of some kind, and then the end that just sweeps in the entire, beginning, middle, and end. And I believe that. I also think comics, I think it's one of the highest art forms when you do it well. And so comedy I think gets underrated as far as an art, because it is so hard to do. So anyway, that's just my own personal, I love poems that make me laugh. That's different than hope, because I expect that a lot when I read poems, but humor is rare, and I think it's a great attribute.
Those are really good points. Actually, I didn't think about the timing. Like, if you look at comedy and humor as maybe not necessarily you need to be funny in your poems, but to maybe learn something about that timing that comics have, right? That they can get so beautifully that sometimes we want in our poetry. So, and also, Jane, you kind of made me think too that maybe it's also important to be true to yourself. And if you're thinking too hard and being self-conscious about, oh, let me make this poem funny, it's not going to be funny, right? Whereas Miles, if he's like second nature and it just exudes like that's him, but I wouldn't want you to write like him, and I wouldn't want Miles to write like you. You both are just each, and Naomi too, you're also unique. So it's also finding a comfort level of who you are as a writer and writing to that. So you're not trying to be somebody that you're not. That's really good points, Jane. Naomi, how about you? What are you thinking with light, hope, and humor?
Well, as Jane said earlier, I agree. I find hope to be one of the most important concepts there is, probably after love. I know it's a very important concept to me in my life, and times when I've gone through really hard things, the one thing I couldn't have kept going without was hope. So I think hope is so important. So I always, no matter what I'm writing about, I always try to include some hope and light in my poems, very much so. I just like Jane said, I love humor, and I wish I could write funny poems. And I really have always admired that Miles can write funny poems, because he really does. There's many funny ones. I've written a few, but it's just not my natural thing. I can be funny, but not in my poetry. So I also think it's underrated. It should not be frowned upon. Just humor is so important. And I also want to say Jane can be very funny as a person, as can Miles, but neither Jane and I really writes funny verse. But it's good that people do, and we need that. So that's all. Just hope is important, and I always want to include it in my poems. And maybe someday I'll write a funny poem. You never know.
Who knows? Maybe that's part of your transformation, right?
That's right.
Well, I'll tell you, we ended on talking about light and hope, and I don't know about you, but especially during this time, events like these where we can come together, even though it's on Zoom, have given me so much light. And today, I really want to thank you for your reading and for your discussion. Your thoughts have just meant a lot to me. So thank you, Miles, Jane, Naomi. Thank you for the Gaithersburg Book Festival organizers. You are so wonderful to coordinate all this. And thank you for all those attending today. Be safe, be well, keep writing, and keep reading.
I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of author presentations taking place right here throughout the month of May. You don't want to miss them. Go to Gaithersburgbbookfestival.org and look over the schedule so you can plan the rest of your festival month. And now here is an important message from renowned author and independent bookstore owner, Ann Patchett, and her dog, Sparky. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog, Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.